Wel, notwaith a bawb. Good evening, everybody. Croeso cynnes iawn I chi gyd I ddalaeth rithriol arall gan y Comisiwn. Heno, Jon Dollery fydd yn trafod ymagwedd newydd at ddigido ffynonellau cartograffig hanesyddol. A warm welcome to you all this evening's lecture by Jon Dollery on a new approach to digitizing historic cartography. As we go through, you're welcome to ask any questions, and Jon will be happy to answer them. But could you please write your questions in the question and answer function? We'd be grateful if you don't use the chat for questions. Thank you. This evening's talk will be recorded and shared on other platforms. For those not watching this live, you're also welcome to send us any questions or share any comments, and Jon will reply to them as soon as possible. Bydd y sgwrs hwn drwy gyffrwng y Saesneg heno, cofiwch fod croeso I chi gysylltu â ni yn y Gymraeg os ydych chi'n am ofyn cwestiwn neu adael sylw. Hoffwn nawr gyflwyno ein siaradwr heno, sef Jon Dollery. Dechreuodd Jon yn y Comisiwn yn 2013 fel ein swyddog mapio. Yn ystod ei amser gyda ni, mae wedi gweithio ar sawl prosiect gan gynnwys Arolwg Ordnans a mapio ein casgliadau ffotograffiaeth o'r awyr. Mae hefyd wedi bod yn rhan o ymchwilio I effaith newid hinsawdd ar yr amgylchedd hanesyddol Cymru. Mae gyda fe ddiddordeb mawr mewn archeoleg dirwedd a sut I ddefnyddio gwasanaethau gwybodaeth daearaddiol I helpu ein dealltwriaeth o dirweddau'r gorffennol. Mae'n aelod o Gymdeithas Cartograffig Prydain a grŵp arolwg tirwedd. Jon started work from the Commission in 2003 as our mapping officer. During his time with us, he has worked on several projects, including the Upland Survey and mapping our aerial photography collections. He has also been involved in investigating the impact of climate change on the historic environment of Wales. He has a keen interest in landscape archaeology and how geographical information services can be used to help our understanding of past landscapes. He is a member of the British Cartographic Society and the Landscape Survey Group. Felly, ar hynny o eiriau, drosodd I Jon.
Diolch yn fawr, Dave. Croeso pawb. Welcome everyone. If you just give me a minute to share my screen. Where are we? One. Okay. So, thanks for Dave's introduction there. So, like I say, my name's Jon Dollery, and I'm the Mapping Officer at the Royal Commission, and I've been in post now for a number of years. And tonight's lecture is going to be looking at a project that I'm currently involved in, which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and the project is called Deep Mapping of Welsh Estates. And as part of that project, one of the things we've been able to develop is a new approach for the digitization of historic cartographic sources ranging from the 17th to the 19th centuries. And also as part of that project, there's potential that we can also look at non-cartographic sources, so things like historical documents and things like that, and how we can potentially map them or bring them into a mapping environment. The other key thing that I'd like to demonstrate tonight is...
Hi, Jon. Sorry, you haven't managed to share your slides yet.
Oh, is it not shared?
Right, just make sure. It's my last introduction, I promise. I hope.
Oh, there we go. Right, can you see that? So I hope that's shared now. Apologies for the minor hiccup there. So like I say, the last thing I'd like to get out of the lecture today is actually show you how you can get access to a lot of the information we're generating as part of this project from these various historic mapping sources today, because a lot of the stuff is available online now, and throughout the course of the project, we will actually be uploading more and more data. Anyway, without further ado, let's move on to the first slide. So the outline for the talk today is I'm just going to talk a little bit about cartography and boundaries and what we mean by them and sort of basics that way. The second part, we're actually going to be talking about the types of historic maps and historic cartographic sources that you tend to get within the rest of the UK, but maybe this will be focused on Wales. The third part is going to be a bit about the project and what we aim to achieve and what we're doing. The fourth part will then be about the actual methodology of how we're actually getting all these map sources together and making them available, and the type of work that we're doing with them. The fifth part is going to be accessing the information. So I'm just going to do a quick demonstration of our new online GIS environment and how you can actually get access to this information as we speak. And then the last two parts are basically about future developments and the potential for this mapping system and things like that. And then obviously leading to a summary. So in terms of cartography and basics, I just want to have a quick discussion about what we mean by maps and boundaries and why they are important. So first of all, why is understanding maps and boundaries important to us, especially from a historic environment and an archaeological context? Well, first of all, maps are fundamental in understanding how we see the landscape around us, both in present as well as for the past. But what we've got to remember with maps is what they depict isn't necessarily truth, because all maps are, by their very nature, subjective. And with that in mind as well, maps only depict what the cartographer wants to show. And also in historical context, usually it's not necessarily the cartographer that depicts things, it's actually the financier or the patron who is paying the surveyor to actually undertake the mapping exercise. So we've always got to keep those things in mind. The other thing to always remember with maps is they are a reflection of the landscape. So like I said, they're not a true depiction because you can't capture everything in a map. They are representation. They can be 2D. In the modern world, they're 3-dimensional, things like that, but they're still a representation of landscape. Maps provide not just context of the landscape and how we understand landscape, but they also have some very interesting and further details we can glean from them, and especially in historical context as well, because they help provide the social and economic values of the time they were created. And we'll see this later with some of the map examples that we look at, especially in the UK with things like the tithe maps and estate maps. You know, maps are surveyed for a specific purpose, and sometimes those purposes do have economic and social values behind them. But at the same time, like with any historic source, you know, we don't take historical sources at face value. We always try to keep in mind critical thinking, and we've always got to do it with maps as well. But with that being said, maps themselves are an important source of information because they effectively can be a time capsule and a window onto the past, and they can give us information such as, you know, how landscape has changed, but also how past landscapes were managed, you know, things like land use and that type of thing. So they are an important source of information. What about boundaries on the other hand? Well, boundaries are quite interesting because they're very similar to maps in the sense that they are human constructs. They can be physical, but they can also be intangible as well. You know, boundaries can be things that separate property, and we can understand them as separating counties and countries, but they can also be intangible. They can be a way of separating cultures. And similar to maps, they're a way of how humans interact with geography and landscape and how they see their place within it. So understanding boundaries in a modern context is quite important, but also understanding how those boundaries have changed over time is also important when going back in an historical context as well. But the boundaries I'm going to be talking about today are going to be more the administrative side of things. So the type of boundaries that I'll be referring to are things like countries, regions, parish, and you know, boundaries in that respect, they can range from very big. So a country can be a fairly large area, but they can also be very small. They can be micro. So, you know, they could be an estate property or estate boundary, a property boundary. You know, most of us live in houses or even flats, and we know the boundaries of our building, that type of thing. They can also be things like field parcels, you know, agricultural fields and things like that. So there's a vast scale of boundaries going from the micro right the way through to the macro. So understanding the importance or the relevance that's placed to put a boundary is integral to how we understand our concept of geography. You know, that's true of today. You know, understanding boundaries helps us put context of how we see our place in the landscape. But equally, in an historical context, understanding our ancestors' concept of boundaries is integral, especially if we want to think about things like, you know, how landscape is developed, what past landscapes look like. You know, we have to enter the mindset of what past boundaries were like both in the administrative sense as well as physical. But what I would say is that, when you start going back in time, people's concept of boundaries were very different to what we have today. So what's interesting there is that, as you go backwards in time, there are types of boundaries that you'll come across which don't exist today. Whereas there are other type of boundaries which we're very familiar with today, which have truly ancient roots. So it's, trying to understand that mismatch of boundaries, which is quite important. So before we go on, what I thought I'd do is do a bit of a top 10 talking about the administrative boundaries of Wales, and just to give you a quick overview what we might be referring to later on in this talk. But the first thing I'd say here as well is that there has been a lot of work over the past 100 years to do with boundaries and understanding those changes. Scholars like William Rees with his Historical Atlas of Wales did a lot of in-depth research about boundaries and how they've changed back in the 1950s. The problem we have today is that although we have these resources, there are very few digital elements of these. And one of the things myself and a colleague at the Royal Commission, Scott Lloyd, have done in the past is to try and recreate some of these digital boundaries. So taking the work like William Rees, who did things like Commots and Cantrevs, which I'll talk a little about in a minute, but bring them into the 21st century and make them useful. It's great having a paper map and paper maps to look from, but now we're in the 21st century, we need to start making that leap towards the digital age. And this is one of the things I'll be talking about later with the project that we're working on, and how we can bring that all that research into the current century. Anyway, in terms of boundaries, the first one you'll all be familiar with is at a level is the country boundary. So as an example here, I've put the country boundary for Wales. Now, it's quite interesting, the Welsh boundary. It's relatively stable. It's been around for about 400 years in the iteration that we know now. But if you go past sort of the Act of Union, the actual country boundary for Wales is very different. What I would say at this stage is that I'm just generally speaking here. I'm not a medieval historian or anything like that. So a lot of this is just going to be generalised, but this is just to give you an overview of the type of boundaries that we're talking about. So like I say, the one we'll all be most familiar with and still exists today is obviously the country boundary, and an example is Wales. Below the country boundary, the next thing you have is county. Now again, some of the county boundaries still exist today. And again, in Wales, they first appear around about the Act of Union, so in the 16th century. But again, these are very interesting because they are largely built in some areas on earlier boundaries. But there's been several iterations of county boundaries over the years. And in fact, some of the audience today who live in the area of Flintshire, perhaps in your lifetime, you've seen several iterations. You might have gone from Flintshire, then to Clwyd, and then back to Flintshire. But the Flintshire today is very smaller than it used to be. But yeah, this gives you a view that, in terms of the hierarchy of boundaries, you've got your country and then county and the various forms they've taken over time. Below the county, or before the counties, you should say, Wales was very different. It was divided into things called cantrevs. So cant meaning 100 and trev meaning towns, roughly translates to 100 towns. And these were large administrative areas that were extant in the medieval period in Wales. We're not too sure how far back they go. There are some instances where they do go back quite a fairly long way, but we know that by the Act of Union in the 16th century, these largely are abandoned, and the county boundaries sort of take over as those large administrative areas. Cantrevs, again, are very interesting because they are areas where Welsh law was practiced, and very different to our counterparts in England. And again, we've got a fairly good idea of where we think the cantrev boundaries were. Below the cantrev, they were further divided again into commots. And again, commots were smaller areas. Each cantrev was roughly, or according to the laws of Hywel Dda and things like that, roughly each cantrev was supposed to be divided into 3 commots, although in practice, there were areas like Cantrev Mawr, which were divided into several commots. But again, these are just smaller administrative areas that were scaled up into the cantrevs, and a way of administering Welsh law and legislature. Below what I would say as well, the way we have managed to recreate this data is that we have records that basically give all the parishes that were in each commot, and then which commots are in each cantrev. So we're pretty confident that what we've got here with these digital maps is not necessarily a very accurate recreation, but you know, a good starting point with which to be able to understand sort of the beginnings of what we'd understand as Welsh medieval landscape. Below the commot, you've then got parish or parishes. So again, these are, you know, most of us would be familiar with parish boundaries, and some of them are still used today. A lot of parish boundaries in the modern sense have been converted to community wards and things like that. But again, parishes are very interesting because, you know, a lot of them do go back a very long time, whereas some of them are relatively modern. I mean, again, we've got a fairly good idea of which ones are modern and which ones are more ancient. But like I say, understanding the development of parishes throughout time and how those boundaries have changed, potentially subtly, but also as we go back into the medieval record, we know that in some areas they could be quite drastic with you know, people taking over lands and things like that. So being able to understand those changes is quite crucial, really, to help understanding how the Welsh landscape has developed over time. And then below the parish, you also then have townships. So again, some townships were divided into townships, others weren't. So the example we've got on the screen here is the parish of Llandegla, and that was actually divided into two townships. So you had Llan, which is this small area to the north, and then the larger area, which is Trefydd Bwcaen. But again, just to give you some inference of the time depth here, we know that the township of Trefydd Bwcaen, we've got references going all the way back to the 13th century. And we know that from some of the records we've looked at, this was quite an important area. So again, you've got a big time depth here with some of these features that are still existing today, and we understand those boundaries now. But then you've also got other larger administrative boundaries which have completely disappeared and have very little relevance to the modern world. Okay, so that just gives you a quick overview of cartography and boundaries. What I'm going to do now is just break down some of the main historic mapping cartography sources that we tend to use when looking at landscape research and that we come across in the UK. What I would say as well is the UK, compared to a lot of nations across the across the world, is uniquely blessed with a good time depth of historic mapping. And what's interesting about this is a lot of our mapping tends to be associated with property and our obsession with, or our historic obsession with property and knowing who knows what. You know, and this goes back a long way to Doomsday. You know, understanding who owned what land, what resources they had. Having that obsession throughout time has meant that we've got a very good collection of historic maps and historical documentary sources by which we can go back a fairly long way. Anyway, so in terms of historic maps, there's 5 types that most people will use when looking at historic landscape regression or understanding how landscapes changed. And these date range from the 16th century right the way up to the late 19th, early 20th century. So the first ones we tend to use are the first edition Ordnance Survey maps, and these were surveyed between 1868 and 1888. You've then got the Ordnance Survey town plans, which were done at the same time. These were drawn at a different scale, and I'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. The next historic sources you've got are the tithe surveys of England and Wales, and these date about 1836 to about 1850, although there were later maps that were produced later than 1850. The Acts of Enclosure that date to about 1773, although there were early acts before then. But the main maps that we tend to use are from 1773 to about 1859. And then the last collection you've got then are estate maps, which range from 1600 to about 1850. And again, these are a vast collection ranging from different areas, different scales, different sizes, but are a fantastic resource. So in terms of the first category, in terms of Ordnance Survey, the first edition OS is probably the best example of early mapping we have that covers pretty much the whole or a large area of Wales and England. So the map you can see on screen at the moment is an example. This is a quarter sheet which shows the area of Trident. And you can see that roughly the detail here, you've got loads of fields that are mapped. You've got buildings, roads, railways. And basically, these were surveyed by the Ordnance Survey to try and map as much detail rural areas to a scale of roughly 1 to 2,500, or that's 25 inches to the mile. There were more maps that were done in detail, which I'll explain in a little bit in a minute, But in terms of wide areas and wide coverage, the 25-inch is probably the best, earliest examples we've got of mapping. And as such, we tend to, from a landscape archaeology point of view, we tend to use the 25-inch as the basis because it covers large areas and is quite well detailed, and the amount of information that's there, it's quite useful then to hang off other historical sources which might earlier in date. And I'll explain a little bit about the process of how we regress the landscape later on. But suffice to say that the first edition is a fantastic resource. Just to give you just an example, we'll zoom in here. You know, the information they contain, you know, they don't just contain information about landscape. They also give us information about historical assets as well. One of the interesting features, fortunately, this map is within the project area that I'm looking at. We've got Offa's Dyke, and we can see, you know, different phases of landscape on these maps. So you've got a medieval feature that's running through the landscape, and you can see to the north west corner there that, you know, you've got a series of mining which has obliterated that section of the dike. And what we could potentially do with earlier maps is, if you get maps which predate that mining, is potentially recreate the original course of the dike and if that's been altered, or whether the dike did actually stop at this point. So these maps are, again, a fantastic resource for allowing landscape research. The other thing I'd like to say quickly just about the OS maps as well is some of them were colorized, some of them weren't. And one of the challenges is, especially when looking at the first edition OS maps, if you've got a colorized version, it's great because you can work out what to build and what isn't. Where if it's all black and white, sometimes it's very difficult to pick out what's a building, what's a yard, and can be very difficult when looking at sort of farms and things like that. The last thing I'll say as well is the Ordnance Survey, when these were surveyed, they started out as cadastral maps. So what that means is that when the surveyors were going out surveying each field, they then would create a book of reference to then record extra information. So within the map, each field be given a number, and then in a book of reference, you could look up that number and it'd give you information such as the acreage of that area, but also sort of things like the land use. What's interesting is that although the the Odin Survey started out doing books of reference, they only did it for certain counties. Unfortunately, in Wales, the counties that were done were Flintshire, Denbighshire, Glamorgan, and parts of Pembrokeshire. And then after then, because of the scale of the task, they decided to put the information on the map rather than have a separate document that you could refer to. And this is an example of the book of reference here. So again, you can see you've got field numbers there. You've got the plan number, the number. You find out the area. It gives you the acreages and also gives you past land use. So effectively, you know, this map that was surveyed in 1871, it gives us a snapshot of the landscape of that period. After or prior to the Ordnance Survey, at the same time, you then had town plans. So this map is a section of the town plan from Mould, and this was surveyed again in 1871. And what the OS did as well is, while they were surveying the sort of 6-inch and 25-inch maps, they also surveyed in greater detail any area that had a population of more than 4,000. And the reason they did this is throughout the 1830s and early 1840s, there were a number of outbreaks and pandemics, unfortunately scarily reminiscent to as we're living today. And maps were used as a way to for public health planning. They could map the spread of disease and infection, and it was a way of combating that type of thing. And as part of that, and as part of when they were doing the 25-inch, it was decided that they would produce these really detailed town plans for any area that had a population more than 4,000. And the amount of detail that's on these maps is phenomenal. The problem with these maps, though, is like they say, they only cover small areas, usually, you know, small towns and big cities. But the information you do get in these maps, like I say, is phenomenal. You've got individual buildings outmarked, where you've got public buildings. And what they did, if it was a public building they could get access to, they surveyed a floor plan. So you can see in this example, you've got the Methodist Chapel in Mould here, with information about how the capacity and how much you could seat. Also, each individual tree that's large, so you've got these cloud trees there, they were also originally surveyed in, so they're actual physical things that were surveyed in. So the amount and wealth of information we've got on these maps is fantastic. Again, they're a snapshot of a town from about 1870, in some cases the area, and we can get a lot of information there and especially comparing it to how these towns have developed through, to today, they are a fantastic resource. Again, the other thing to note about these is they are colorized. So again, it's very easy to work out where things are and that type of thing. Prior to the Ordnance Survey, you had the Tithe Survey for England and Wales, and these were surveyed between 1836 1850, although as a caveat there were tithe maps that were produced much later than that. But that tends to be the sort of main thrust of the surveying period. The examples you've got on the screen, just to give you a heads up, is the tithe map for the township of Tryfyn. And you can see that it's a very clear map. Again, it's cadastral in nature. So they go out and record each field, and then there's a book of reference. Each field is given a number, and then that in the book of reference that has all the information such as landowner, who's the tenant of the area, what the field is being used for. Now, the reason behind these maps is that the practice of tithe goes back way into the medieval period. And effectively, you were expected, if you were to make produce, so if you were a labourer or own land, you were expected to give a tenth of your produce to the church. And for ages, that was done in kind. So if you were growing barley, you'd give a tenth of the barley to the church. And this is where you get your establishment of things like tithe barns. They were used to store these goods. However, by 1836, it was decided in an Act of Parliament, rather than having goods in kind, that they would move to a monetary-based system. So these maps were produced to try and work out what the acreage of each titheable plot of land was, and then based on that acreage, work out the cost that the tithe would be for that person. What I would say is about these tithe maps, although they're a fantastic resource, because they were surveyed in isolation, so the OS, when they surveyed, they did it in totality. The tithe maps, on the other hand, were done by different surveyors over different periods, and they did them parish by parish. And as such, the maps themselves don't entirely always match up. So that's sometimes one issue. The tithe maps you can get access to at the moment, especially for Wales. They were all digitised in a project called Cynefin, and I'll circulate the links to you later. You can actually view these maps online today. The other thing to say about tithe maps as well, and how they can be difficult. So the example you've got on the screen now is a beautiful example, well surveyed, very clear, but sometimes you get tithe maps like this. So this is the tithe map for Llanberis, and as you can see, the condition of it's not great. And even as you zoom in, it's very difficult to work out where fields are. So again, one of the issues that differs from things like the OS is depending on the survivability of the area you're looking at, or the way it was surveyed, it can be difficult to map these features. And again, here's just an example of, like I say, these maps were cadastral in nature. So they recorded not just the map, all the information, ancillary information. And this was put into an apportionment. And this is an example of apportionment here. So you can see you've got the field numbers, you've got the landowner, who the tenants were, field names, which is very important. You actually got the names of fields. But then also you've got state of cultivation, the acreages, and things like that. The next maps we have are then the enclosure maps. So the image below is an example of an enclosure map for Llandegla, and this was surveyed in 1830. So enclosure maps themselves were surveyed between 1773 and 1859. And effectively, this goes back to a time when we had common land and wasteland. Throughout the medieval period, a lot of the landscape was divided into these two categories. Common land would have been owned by a lord, but effectively there was rights that local people could have to graze sheep and cattle and stuff on that land. And effectively, this was land that wasn't good for agriculture, it was only good for grazing and things like that. But there were certain rights that people had, for a very long time. Waste, on the other hand, is more land that was in areas that were either inaccessible or on steep slopes. So land that, again, wasn't good for cultivation, and also wasn't that good for things like grazing and stuff like that. But in the 1730s, 1770s, it was decided that rather than have these areas of common land, that they would be sold off and divided between the townspeople. Now, initially, I know a lot of historians have looked at this, the Great Swindle. These were supposed to be open talk that people could go to and basically put their claims to the land. But most times, or 9 times out of 10, it was a local gentry who would have these meetings in private. They would hire their own surveyors, their own purchasers, and they would divide the landscape and basically buy it up themselves. But again, these are very interesting areas of land because they then basically bolted onto things like estates and stuff like that. So understanding these enclosures are quite integral to understanding the development of the industrial landscape. What's interesting about these maps, though, is effectively they give us a wealth of information. So the first one is that they show us a designed landscape. So these maps are actually drawn before the actual landscape features were put in. So they were basically plotted out where the enclosure areas would go. So on this map, anything that's a dotted line was basically what was going to be put in. It wasn't just fields that were put in as well. There were also things like trackways, paths, wells, quarries. All of this was designed to help sustain the enclosure. What's interesting about this, though, is that when looking at a landscape point of view, and especially in upland areas, when we see trackways, we assume that these things are very old or go back a long way. But actually, most of the time, if you actually look at the enclosure map, it actually dates to then. So what the important thing of these maps are is that we can actually put a proper date to a landscape feature. So we can say, well, we know that this field was put in sometime after this map was produced. So for instance, the big area on screen, which was put in as a field, it's still there today. We can say, well, that comes from about 1830 or after 1830 when this map was produced. They also show us the landscape before it was divided up into enclosure. Now, there's two interesting things there. The first thing is that if you look to the middle of the screen there, you've got the late William Rees and Samuel Jones. Those are areas of encroachment. So in this period, or before the 1770s, there was a process by very poor people could actually encroach on common land. And I think there was something, if they could, whatever they could enclose in a day, they could build and farm on. So you've got these small patches of encroachment, and these were, existed prior to these maps. So we've got, a definitive thing that to say, well, we know that these areas didn't exist before, or existed before 1830. The other interesting thing, which is far more important from a medieval point of view, is that if you strip away what was planned, potentially you're getting back to a medieval landscape here. We know that developers in these areas, it didn't take off. This was the first time that this area was developed. So we can confidently say that, before this development, what we're looking at here is a medieval landscape. And I'll show you an example later. We know in some areas that the actual boundary between agricultural land and common land was relatively static. We've got examples going back to about 1600, and the only time it changed is when, in the 1830s, 1840s, the actual enclosure, that was the only significant time that those boundaries changed. So effectively, we can look at static landscapes here as well. The last example I'll talk about is estate maps. So again, these are a fantastic resource. Again, enclosure maps, going back to the previous point, one of the issues we've got with enclosure maps is they only cover the area of enclosure. So they only cover common land, whereas tide maps and the first edition OS cover large areas. Estate maps are very similar. So the example we've got on screen here is from Newydd Hall, and this was surveyed in 1737. And again, these are a fantastic source of mapping. They give us information about land ownership, so who owned what and what land belonged to which estate. Again, the cadastral, so they give us information about land use, ownership, how things are divided up. They also give us field names, which can be quite important, especially from historical research point of view. But also, every estate map's different. There's not one, two of the same. And this is a fantastic example because we've got an elevation drawing here of Newydd Hall and what it looked like in 1737. So again, these are a great source of information. The problem with these maps is that they can be rare. So not every estate would have an estate map. Estates themselves vary in size. You've got some massive estates, some are relatively small. It could be sitting more farms. So it's likely that they may not have had an estate map. But also to survivability. Some of these maps have been, handed into collections and archives, and some are still in private hands. So one of the main issues we've got with estate maps, although they're a fantastic resource, they can be very difficult to get hold of, and they can be very difficult to use. And this is one of the reasons why we've brought this project together, is to bring all this information together, especially the estate maps, so they're easily more accessible. The last thing I'd say about these estate maps as well is that, again, they go back quite a long way. Some of the earliest estate maps we know of go to about 1620. Before then, you've got a lot of documentary sources, but the fact that we've got maps that go back to almost 300 years, 400 years is an achievement itself. And there's not many countries that have that ability to go back that far with their mapping. And at a glance, surveyed mapping as well. That's the key thing there. These are all surveyed. So I've talked about the project, but I want to explain what it actually is that we're doing. So like I say, a lot of organisations, so ourselves, the Institute for Welsh Estates at Bangor University and Aberystwyth University, there were a couple of colleagues that got together and decided that we wanted to do a mapping project. There have been things in the past like Cynefin, which was very successful, and we wanted to do not something similar, but a good mapping project, but mainly focusing on things like the estate maps, because again, they're a very underutilized collection. They're a fantastic source of information, but they are notorious to get hold of and to use. So, throughout the discussions, it was always clear that we want to do something with estate maps. But as the discussions evolved, we decided that we wanted to do something that was actually, how can we bring all these sources together in one place? So not just the estate maps, but things like tide maps, enclosure maps, the first edition OS. And one of the things that we know from landscape archaeology to do retrogressive analysis, we do this thing called deep mapping. So bringing all these sources together in one environment is what we call a deep map. So it's a map because you've got a wide area, but it's also a deep map because you've got that time depth of layers going backwards in time. So it was decided that we would collaborate on a project together and seek funding. So the project team consists of Dr. Sean Evans from the Institute of the Study of Welsh Estates, who's the director, and he's got a background in estate mapping and estate projects, and did his PhD thesis on the Mostyn. So he's got a wealth of experience in that type of thing. From Aberystwyth University, we've got Dr. Julie Mathias, and again, she's an archive researcher and does a lot of archive management, but she also specialises in copyright. And we thought that skill might be invaluable because looking to try and bring all these sources together, one of the issues you might have is the copyright around those images, especially with estate maps where they might have been loaned by the family, and then since they've been in the archive, the family may have lost touch of it or whatever. So, there might have been issues that would come up around that sort of thing. And the last organisation is obviously ourselves at the Royal Commission, which consisted of myself and another colleague, Scott Lloyd, who is our project officer, fundraising officer. But Scott's got a background in sort of medieval history. He's our local authorian expert, but also he's done a lot of stuff with place names and things like that. In partnership, because of these collections and how spread out they were, it was crucial that we get, to the people who've got a lot of these collections. Fortunately in Wales, a lot of collections are either with local archive services. So in this case, it was Flintshire and Denbighshire Archive, which is now the North East Wales Archive Service. And then they also got the National Library of Wales as well. And also the National Library as a partner agreed that any information or maps, survey maps that we came across, that they would digitize them for us as well. And basically, as part of this bid for this deep mapping project, we applied for the AHRC, or Arty Mountain Research Council, and we applied as Sean Evans as our PI, or project officer, and he applied for an early career development grant of 250,000, which we were awarded. And effectively, we were going to start the project in June 2020, but then obviously events overtook us, events be a boy events. So unfortunately, we weren't able to start actually in earnest until September 2020 last year. So we've roughly been doing the project now for about a year. Okay, so what do I mean by deep map? So like I explained before, we're trying to bring all these mapping sources into one place so it's easily accessible. But the most important thing as well is that because these maps vary in time and scale and size, you can actually start cross-referencing those maps if you bring them together in a single environment. And the way you do that, especially these days, is the environment we use is GIS, or Geographic Information System. Most of us would be familiar with certain aspects of GIS, like Google Maps, Bing Maps, Google Earth. They are in essence a GIS system. They allow you to view information in a spatial context. But GIS is a fantastic environment because it allows you to bring in layers or maps that you can overlay one on top of the other. And the best way to think of a deep map is a cake. So you've got your layers of a cake, each slice or each layer in that cake representing a map or a slice in time. And it's through the analysis of those different layers going backwards that you can understand the development of the landscape. And what we call this in a landscape archaeology context is retrogressive analysis, or a top-down approach, where you start from the present and you go through each mapping source to see how the landscape's changed. The ethos behind this project as well is that, like I say, you've got all these maps, bring them into one central place, makes it easy. But there have been other projects in the past which have done this, like Cynefin brought all the tide maps together. And while it's great, you know, getting these maps in a GIS and seeing the images and geo-reference, so overlaid on a modern map, is fantastic. Now we're in the 21st century, we can also go one step further. And that step further is what we call polygonization. So what we can do with those historic maps is actually generate data from them that's interrogatable, but also allows us to do other things. And I'll talk a little bit later about the type of things we can do. So here's an example of a polygonal layer. So each feature on the map, whether it's a building or a field or a wall, is given a polygon, so a shaped area that defines that area. And what you can do is behind each polygon is a database, and you can have as much information in that database that you want. So you can click on a field or a building or a parcel, and then you can get a record, like you can see on screen here, and then you can record whatever information you want. So usually that'll be information that's in the map. So here we've got things like it's the White Lion, it's a pub, it's the cyan area here, that's a footprint of a pub. We know it's a building, we know what map it's from, so we could record all that information. The other thing as well is that if you've got things that are cadastral, so like I say, if you've got those books of reference, so they're not part, they are part of the map, but they're not actually in the map, you can then also record the information that's in that documentary source into that record as well. The last good thing about this as well is that we can embed hyperlinks. So where you've got a map from a certain area or a certain archive, you can actually put a hyperlink in that will link to that archive and credit those sources. So again, this is a very quick way of actually spatially archiving, being able to spatially visualize all our archive data, especially in regards to maps. But there is also potential that you could do this for historic documents as well. So again, it's just a fantastic integrated resource. So project area. Effectively, we decided to do a small area of 6 parishes. As part of the project, we couldn't do a massive area because we saw this as a pilot. So we decided that we do a small area, but try and get as many map sources as possible for that area. And we chose the parishes of Llanferris, Llanarmon, and Llandegla in Denbighshire, and the parishes of Mold, Mercwys, and Tryden in Flintshire. So the reason we chose these is that, first of all, you've got that Flintshire-Denbighshire border. So not only did we want to get information about the maps, as we also want to understand how these boundaries changed over time. And we know that this area, there have been some significant boundary changes. So we chose it in that sense. We also chose it because there's a good ratio of common land to managed land. And the reason I say that is because you've got all these various mapping sources. Like I said before with the enclosure maps, we know that past a certain point in date, that there'll be hardly any maps for that area, and that area wouldn't change. So, you know, roughly here with the common land being 43% of the survey area, we know that beyond 1800, it's unlikely that those sections of land would have changed at all. We also chose this area because you've got Mold, which is a historic market town. And again, that gives us an urban landscape by which to test our mapping methodology. So it's not just about the rural or upland landscape. We also want to try and see how would this work for an urban area. And the last thing we did as well is we chose this area because we know, especially Tryden, Mercwys, you've got a vast collection of small estates. So you've got places like Bodidrys, Tower, Geshley Gunnan. We also know you've got big landowners here, like the Mostons and the Grosvenors from Cheshire. But also, we know that the maps we've got for these areas go way back. In fact, the earliest map we know for Tryden goes back to about 1620. So we knew, initially, before doing our research, we had a good idea that there would be a good depth of historical mapping in this area too. Just to give you a bit of context of how things have changed and why we chose from the boundary side of things, if you go back to 1880, the way we understand the landscape is very different. So things like Tryden and Mercwys weren't their own parishes. In 1880, they were actually townships of Mold. So you can see there's been a bit of change there. So since then, you know, they've become their own parishes. The other thing to note is that the Flintshire-Denbighshire border was also completely different. You've got this big jutty out bit between Llanarmon and Jarl. Effectively, that section, although today is Llandegla, historically was in Llanarmon, and that section you've got in the north bit, that was part of Denbighshire, and that bulbous bit coming out was part of Flintshire. So you've got all these, different things going on, and it wasn't until sort of the turn of the 19th century that boundary was actually rationalised. So we've got these quirks. Now, what's interesting about these quirks historically is, I would put money on that these go back potentially a long way, and they refer to things like lordships and stuff like that. So being able to understand why those boundaries are the way they are, and I know we know they've changed now because of simplification, but understanding why those boundaries exist in the past is quite important. If you go back even further in time, we know that Llanarmon, Llanberis, and half of Llandegla was in the Commot of Jarl. And again, Jarl goes back quite a long way. We've got references to it all the way back in the medieval period. But also, you can see here that Llandegla itself was split between Jarl and another Commot called mae'r Gymraeg. So again, you've got these differences of boundaries there, and being able to understand, well, why has that changed? When did it change? What bearings does it have on the landscape is quite important. Whereas the parish of Mold, on the other hand, we know fit in within the Commot of Ystrad. The last thing we got here as well then is the cantrevs. So like I said before, several commets made a cantrev. So the cantrevs here again, you've got the cantrevs of Tegengel, which effectively is a Flintshire, Parasvadog, and different Lloyd, which we now are part of Denbighshire. So again, it just shows that you go back long enough, the way we understand landscape is very different. So what are the objectives of the project? Well, the first one, like I've explained, is to digitize, gather, and polygonize all the relevant survey maps within the project area from various archives, organizations, private collections, and this is going to give us that deep map. The second thing is to gather data on how intensive this methodology is and its viability for it to be upscaled. So if we want to do this in a bigger project, this is a pilot area. If we wanted to do it for a parish or potentially for the whole of Wales, this will give us the information on the methodology of how scalable it is. Create a publicly accessible online GIS. So get that information out to the public that's freely accessible. That's a key thing there. And we're talking here not just about the digital maps, but also that polygonal data as well. And then using this data with all the historic sources coming back and getting things like place names, can we then use that to actually map things that were never mapped? So things like historic documentary sources, rentals, wills, charters, monastic records, secular records. Can we use that information to get even further back in time than the 16th century? We've also then got developing a deep map can help us understand the development of Welsh estates. So this is where Sean Evans comes in. So he's very much interested in development of Welsh estates and how they developed over time. So this deep map will help us answer some of those questions. Developing this system will enable the spatial searching of archive material. So again, this is a test subject to see, well, if we did stuff in this way with other archives in future in a bigger project, is this a way of being able to visualize that archive material spatially? Importing all mapping sources into a deep map will identify where our areas of landscape are patchy. So where you've got loads of historical sources, say for instance, estate maps, if we can work out the patchwork of how those estates develop, we can then also work out areas where we don't have mapping. And then we get like a detective story, we then might be able to infer where we might be able to find the information for those missing areas. So it's letting the sources dictate where the research area blanks are, rather than just the assumption where those areas are. Develop a standard methodology to assess if this framework could be used to ingest other studies. So again, with landscape archaeology and landscape research, there are a phenomenal amount of people out there, brilliant people who've done a lot of research on local areas and it's, to a great depth, and they have a fantastic understanding. The problem is that usually that research stays with them, or it's very rarely circulated widely. Whereas what we could do with this system is, if people do it in a certain way and we establish that methodology, it could be that we could then use this to ingest other data to then expand out. So it's not just, the data, the area we're interested in, how can we scale this and can we ingest other things that have happened in the past? And the last thing is then create a number of localized data sets, which could be then used to enhance other data sets. So what we're talking about here is that things like Natural Resources Wales, inventory for ancient woodland. So their data, they only go up to the first edition OS, but because we're using older maps, can we actually infer and say, well, the plantation here that's on the first edition, you're saying is ancient, we actually know this was planted in 1776. So, by that standard, might not be ancient, but we can start putting dates down to things and refining our information. So, the methodology. Well, how do we actually do all this? How are we bringing all these maps together? What are we actually doing? Well, basically, there's three main steps. So the first one is digitization. The second one is geo-referencing or rectification of those historic maps. And the last one then is polygonization, so making digital data out of those historic maps. And effectively, what we're calling this process is total digitization. So we're trying to record all the information is recorded on each map, as well as the information that might be ancillary in things like the books of reference and things like that. So step one, digitize the map. So you've got your historic map, you scan it to a high resolution as possible. And there's two reasons for this. The first one is that it helps when we come to map and bring it into the system that you've got the highest resolution copy as possible. The second thing is then you can also archive that digital image. So especially if it's a map that hasn't been scanned before, you can then use that. So rather than getting the map out every time someone wants to look at it, they've got the digital image there they can refer to and make available. So the National Library is scanning, for this project, is scanning all of the digital material that isn't already scanned. Geo-referencing rectification. So basically, this is the process of overlaying one map on another. And how we do this is basically we take the historic map and a modern map, and we look for correlation in terms of field boundaries. So things that still exist on the historic map that still exist today, we can add points, usually at the corner of fields, and then we can basically put 2 points on each map, and that will snap the point. And the more points you generate, that will then fit and stretch and warp the map to the modern map. So it's a fantastic way of being able to get these historic maps and overlay them as accurately as possible to the modern map that we know today. So an example of this, so we've got this is the first edition OS sheet. This was surveyed in 1873. It's just outside the project area, and you've got a fantastic A&H hill foot there of Mullaghyer. So you've got your sheet, you then open your GIS and locate the modern map to where you are, and then you import the map and then start adding the control points. So as you can see here, I'm putting control points on boundaries or the edges of boundaries that exist on this map, but they also exist on the modern map. And the more control points you have, the better the fit. So what we tend to do with our project, the maps that we're geo-referencing, is we tend to average about between 300 and 1,000 points per map, depending on the complexity or the area. So, if you've got a map that covers a massive area, you're going to have a lot of control points. Whereas you've got a map that covers a small area, you're obviously going to have less. And the more control points you have, or once you finish your control points, you then do a thing called spline. So this is an algorithm which then scales the map, it merges it, and it stretches it to the modern map underneath. And effectively, you get a map that looks something like that. So you can see here that map, the historic map, I've made it transparent. You can see it fits nicely over the modern map underneath. The last stage then is polygonization. So this is the process of actually creating the digital data for the geo-referenced historic map. So once you've got your map geo-referenced, we then do this process of polygonization. So what we do, like I say, is we actually create polygons for each individual feature. So that's a building or a parcel, and basically we make a shape for them. Rather than doing that data ourselves, there's actually already a polygon layer that's a modern mapping layer called OS Master Map. And that is what the OS use. They draw these polygons to create the modern maps that we know today at various scales. And what we effectively do is we take a copy of modern master map, and then we can change and alter it to reflect the historic map underneath. So as an example, here's our historic map. If we overlay master map over the top, you can see that the red line is each polygon. So within that, it's a full shape. I've just made the actual polygon shape transparent so you can see the map underneath. So you can see that you've got a series of red lines here, each polygon, and you can see that actually a lot of the time, things like first edition, there's a lot of correlation between the historic maps and modern day, but there are some subtle differences. And what we do through a process of either merging the polygons or splitting them to reflect the historic map underneath, effectively, we can then generate a data set which reflects the historic map. And you can see there that you've got these nice polygons and it fits the map almost perfectly. And the idea is then is I can click on any one of those polygons and get information. And I'll demonstrate in a minute how that works. So why do it this way? Well, first of all, by using the OS master map, we don't have to do it by hand. If we had to polygonize everything by hand, it would take forever. The second thing is by using master map and aligning our maps to them, we're reducing surveyed errors that might have existed in the old historic maps. With historic maps, they were surveyed at different times using different scales, but also different methods. So if you go back early enough, they were using roods, acres, and perches, they were surveyed with chains, and there's always some inaccuracy in historic maps. By doing it this way, you're actually potentially minimizing that survey accuracy there. And what I would say is certainly with the 25-inch OS mapping, our accuracy is within 2.5 meters. For the tithe, we're saying an accuracy of we're in about 3 to 4 meters. But compared to modern products, that is still very good, and it's about as accurate as you're ever going to get. We also, by having these polygons, we can do checksums by acreages. So when we created the polygons, we can actually generate an acreage. Now, a lot of the historic mapping sources also record the acreage of that field. So by checking the acreage that we got in the polygon with the historic acreage, that's the way that you can check that if they're similar in number or similar number, we've got the right field. And what we've been able to prove so far is I've said 90%, it's even more than that. All of our data tends to be within 0.5 of an acre, roughly about, sort of 95% of our maps so far have come in within that acreage. So it's just a way of checking that what we're doing is actually accurate and reflects the maps underneath. Okay, so polygonize, rectify, repeat. So the idea is that once you've done your first map, the first edition, you then do exactly the same process for the next map in the sequence. So in this instance, it would be tide maps. So again, you're scanning your tide map, you georeference it, you then polygonize it, but you polygonize it from the polygons you created from the 25-inch. So basically, you're piggybacking from each data set to the other. But it's an easy way. Once you've got the 25-inch sorted, the actual mapping then becomes easier and easier the further back you get in time, mainly because the maps themselves are less complicated, but also because they're, like I said, they're just a lot easier, a lot more easy to see as well. So as an example here, you've got, this is just a quick infographic. So you've got your modern map, then the historic map underneath, and then the tide. And like I say, you just do the process for each one, going back as far back as you can go. So what are the benefits? Why are we creating polygonal data? What's the point? So this is an example on screen here. This is an example of all the 25-inch sheets for a small area that covers roughly near and Trident. So once you've got this polygonal data, like I say, you can click on any one of those features and then get information about that, that whether it's a building or a farm or whatever, or an agricultural field. You can get all the information that's recorded about that feature on that map. And like I say, each map is given its own polygonal layer. So not only can you do that, you can also, once you've generated polygons for different maps, you can then see how they fit together. So these are two tide maps for Trident and Newydd. So if we try to do this with the paper counterpart, it would be impossible because they were surveyed at different times, and they don't match up. If you look at Cynefin for these, they don't match up. Whereas with polygonal data, it matches up perfectly. So again, this is a way of being able to make seamless mapping across sources. So like all the tide maps we'll have in the project area will have seamless mapping like the 25-inch. The other thing we can do is just quickly overlay. We can change symbology. So this is an example of anything that's purple here is the Trident. This was surveyed in 1838. Anything that's darker, that is the first edition OS, which is 1871. But just an example. So I've zoomed into this area. So anything that's purple is extant and we know exists in 1838, whereas anything that's grey we know is much later. So straight away we can see where the differences in landscape and how landscapes change, develop at the click of a button. With the polygonal data as well, like I say, because we've got that symbology and with all the data that's recorded in the attribute table, we can then actually generate our own maps from them. So, with the original map, it just shows you what it shows you. Whereas this polygonal data, we can actually change the symbology to highlight things. So this is just a quick example. We're just showing the actual land use here. So you've got agricultural fields, buildings, woodland, and at a glance, you can see straight away. So this is the tide map for Newydd, and this was surveyed in 1839. So again, we've got a snapshot of the landscape there at a click of a button of what it would have potentially looked like in 1839. Same map, but what we can do here as well, because they record which farms owned which field, we can actually then use that symbology and change it to reflect which farms owned which land parcels. So again, straight away, we can actually see which farms own those fields, and we can look and visualize it on the map. The last things we can do, and these are just 3 examples, a lot more we can do, but I just thought I'd show you quick examples. The last one, which I think is very interesting, is actually looking at gender ownership. So we've got the, with these maps, we've got the owners, the landowners, we know their gender, and at a click of a button, we can actually generate a quick map to show the, which land was owned by males, which land was owned by females, and which land was owned by, mixture. So again, it's just a quick way of visualizing that landscape. And again, there's a lot more research you could do with this, gender studies, things like that. All this information is there, and you can then use that and extrapolate from that data whatever it is that you're interested in. We're also generating additional data sets too. So it's not just polygons. Again, because we're interested in boundaries, what's interesting about these maps is that we can actually start generate really accurate boundary data. So the first edition is a fantastic example, because this is the first time that boundaries really were static. Before then, boundaries were static, but they were surveyed at different times, and sometimes there's a lot of discrepancies between one map and another, like with the tithe maps. Whereas in the first edition, they went out their way to hire 2 people from each parish with a surveyor, and they walked each boundary to map in where it was exactly. What they also did is they put braces in. So each section of each boundary was also recorded. So things like if a boundary ran from this section to one section, it was 4 foot from root of hedge or face of wall. So what we can do is we can actually generate polyline data, which is similar to polygons, but it's a line of those areas. And from that, we can actually generate a boundary map for each parish, township, whatever. And again, we can click on that information. There's a database behind it, and we can see that for highlighted boundary there, that we know that that section of boundary was the face of wall. And again, you can then take those lines and create polygons. So we've got a polygon here for the parish of Trident. And again, this township of Trident. And again, we can then stick that with other data. And like I said before about, there's being very little digital boundary data sets, or the ones that do exist, they're on a big scale. This is the start of a comprehensive township boundary data set for Wales. So, there's all these different products we can get from the data as well. Historical documentary sources as well. I know I've mentioned about, it could be possible to actually bring in other sources. How can we do this? Well, because of these wealth of mapping, they record things that sometimes get lost. And one of the key things they record are things like place names. So we know, for instance, the Enclosure Maps actually record stream names. We also know that tithe maps record and estate maps record field names and things like that. And once you've got these names, if you can find a documentary source that's close in time to that source, or within 100 years or so, it's possible that you can then say, well, this documentary source is referring to these field names. It's possible then, if those field names are the same, you can actually generate a map of that historic documentary source. Of course, that doesn't mean it's perfect, but at least it's the start. We can start getting these documentary sources in, and these documentary sources go way back. We also got things like perambulations. So we know for, there's the bishopric of St. Asaph and stuff like that. I've got perambulations for parishes. And again, once you've got certain place names which are picked up on some maps, so an example would be Moyle Lom, we know that that is a point boundary that exists between Flintshire and Denbighshire, and that goes all the way back to 1300s. So again, if we can pick up these maybe names that might have disappeared or as a common use now, if we can actually start mapping these things, there's potential that we can actually map or remap boundaries that go back a long way. So effectively, we're talking about recreation of maps. So in these last few sections, I just want to show you quickly how you can actually get access to all this information. I appreciate there's a lot we covered there, and I'm quite conscious of time. So there are some links here that I will share in the chat at the end of the discussion, so you can all get access to it. But these are basically online GIS tools. So hopefully you can see my screen here. So this is the main GIS we've got at the moment for recording this information. It's all online, all freely accessible. What I will say at this stage is they are still in development. So they're not perfect, but they are a start of trying to get some of that data out there. And they're really easy to use. So on the left here, you've got your layers. So if I click on that, I can then upload. So we will put in the first edition Ordnance Survey. So this actually brings in the OS sheets for the project area. And if I zoom in further, you'll be able to see that they will become clearer. One thing I will say as well, we are going to put higher res mapping. Again, because this is a testing environment, we put lower grade resolution mapping in. But there you go, you've got the first edition. So these are the paper maps, what we're basing everything on. However, if I turn on the parcels, so click that on, give it a minute, you see then we've got this vector or this polygonal data that overlays the top there. And if I click on a field, or click on that field there, you can see we've got all the information for that mapping layer, for that field going through there. So that you can see that this is an agricultural field. You've got the acreages, and you can see that within 0.1 of an acre. And there's all the information there that you can get associated with that. You've also got links then out to the archive source that we've got that map from. So we've got the Ordnance Survey on there. We've also got the tithe maps as well. So I'll give you a second. So again, you've got the tithe map underneath here. Again, you can click these or both maps on at the same time. So this is the tribe and tithe map. And again, with the polygonal data, you can click that layer on. You can click on a field, and you've got all the information there about that specific feature on that map. So here you can see that that field is called K. Pisclodin. And yeah, you've got what it was used for. You've got the ownership. So we know this was owned by Miss Elizabeth Gifford, who was of Nearquist Hall. You've got the occupier as well. So this is the farmer who is the tenant. And you've got a wealth of information there as well. The last thing I'll show you as well is the Trident Enclosure Survey. So again, these are the enclosure maps. We are uploading more of these. At the moment, all that's on there is the Trident Nearquist tithe maps, the first edition maps for those area, but you've also got this tithe maps and the enclosure map as well. So again, you've got the enclosure map here. And again, like I was saying before, if I click on this digital layer, you can see that these are the fields that were planned. So these were actually put in 1830. So again, if I click on that information, you've got the name of what it was, the allotment, who was it awarded to? It was awarded to Thomas Roberts. So you've got a wealth of information there. But if we strip those fields away, and if I turn this on, which is the pre-enclosure, we can actually see, well, that's actually what the landscape would have looked like pre-enclosure. So if I just turn the map off to give you an example there. So we know this whole area, this whole block of land, that orange block, wouldn't have changed or was unlikely to have changed way back into the medieval period. And it was only in 1830 that the infrastructure was built that we recognise today. So again, you can see very quickly how you're getting this breakdown. The last thing I'll show you as well, before we move on to the last little area, is the town plans. So again, these are a fantastic resource. Again, this works exactly the same. So you've got the original images. So again, it's a bit lower scale, but if you zoom in, you'll be actually able to see the historic maps there. And you'll see that some of them are colorized, some of them aren't. But here you go. Here's the image we've got here. St. Mary's Church in mold. So as we zoom in, it'll get clearer. And if I turn on the digital vector layer, you'll see that we can actually colorize these things. So where you've got some colorized sheets and some that aren't, because it's vector data, we can actually colorize the whole area. And it just makes it more visibly seeable. You can see all the information. And again, you click on a polygon. So let's click on the post office, and you've got all the information there that's then bounded within the town plan, links out. And like I say, I'll drop the links in the chat at the end of the talk, so you can all go and have a play with these things. But like I say, I hope it can demonstrate to you here how quick and easy it is to access all this information. Okay, I'll just move the other bit here as well. We'll carry on with the talk. So, future developments and potential. So just to give you a quick overview of where we are today, like I say, we've been working on this since September. Throughout that period, we focused on mainly the digitization of 25-inch, mainly because that's the most complicated mapping that we've got for the project area, because there's a wealth of information on there. And as you go further back in time, the actual mapping assets themselves become much more easier to manage. So over the past year, we've been focused mainly on the 25-inch. So this grid here shows you the actual map sheets of the 25-inch. So there's 48 of them, first edition sheets. And this is how much we've done to date. So we've done pretty much 2/3 of the area. So we've completed 33 sheets. Out of those sheets, we've actually created 26,142 polygons, which I think is quite a good achievement. And we've also created 2,450 polylines. We've also, like I say, created vector data and, for the tithe map. So we've done Nearquist and Trident, and we've also done that enclosure map. But over the next few months, our main thing is going to be to complete the first edition OS mapping. That's hopefully going to be completed by the end of this month, the remaining sheets. Then we're going to upload all the OS mapping onto that mapping platform by October 2021. And hopefully we'll also have better resolution OS map sheets there as well. We'll then be focusing on the tide and enclosure maps. So we hope to, because they're a smaller collection of them and a lot easier to map, we're hoping to have them finished between October and December 2021. We'll then be focusing on estate maps and documentary sources. So again, because estate maps are various, there's about 100 that we've come across now. They're being scanned over the next few weeks. So we'll be actually geo-referencing and polygonizing those map data sets between January and March 2022, and the project will be coming to an end in September 2022. And hopefully, apart from the OS, we'll be hopefully incrementing and uploading data as we go along. So I just want to talk quickly about the unlimited possibilities. I know I've gone through this relatively quickly, but the amount of information we're recording here is phenomenal. And also, we think the uses of this information also is not unlimited, but there's a lot of potential. You know, having these polygons or effectively creating a master map for all these maps of the past gives us a wealth of information, and not just from the heritage environment or the heritage sector, but also places like Natural Resources Wales, local and regional government. You know, we can use all this data to start really planning things. We've also got, in the commission, we've got a list of place names, inventory of historic place names. So we can get all this data, not just in one place, but we can also then use it to enhance our other data sets as well. The main one I'm quite excited about is the town plans. Not only are they beautiful, but also you could potentially, once this project is finished, if you were to do a project, just looking at the town plans for Wales, you could then link off other things like crowdsourcing projects. So, you know, because we've got individual buildings and plots of buildings, we can start, you know, linking the house numbers. And if you've got the house numbers, well, then you can link to the census records. So, you know, a big market out there is family history, but actually having a family member being able to see a map, if their ancestor lived in a town, they'll be able to actually see the building or footprint of the building they lived in, I think would be phenomenal. So you've got, and we could do that through crowdsourcing. So, you know, get the public to help do this. You've also got things like the Victorian directories. You can link them to historical newspapers. Potentially, you could start actually linking down historical events. So if you've got, you know, a brawl or, you know, something like the Rebecca riots, you can actually then link it down to specific landscape features. And again, it's another way of visualizing historic events in a landscape context. The other things you've got like World War II, World War I, World War II, especially bombing damage from World War II. If you're doing big places like Swansea or Cardiff, again, that would be a fantastic tool to integrate there. So in summary, what I just want to talk over is the main points of all this data and how we can use it. So the first one is, you know, this deep mapping of landscape. I think that, you know, by bringing all these sources together in one place is critical for people being able to access this information. Now, I appreciate that all this information is split out between different organizations, and of course it should remain so. But if we had a framework by everyone could input into that and there's one location, I think that makes a fantastic resource for people to be able to use. It's also, like I say, a way of being able to visualize all these historic maps. And like I say, we've got a wealth of them through the period of not just in Wales, but also the rest of the UK. So having a framework of something like this is an exciting prospect. Also, it's a way of potentially starting getting back to the really exciting periods. You know, from a landscape archaeology point of view, we always start at the same point, which is always the first edition OS. However, if we do this on a larger scale and we can remove and do that for people, you know, people will be able to get back in history much quicker with research. So rather than everyone having to start at the same point, we can take that point and raise it much lower down. So rather than everyone starting in 1890, people will be able to start the research looking from the 1800s and maybe back even earlier. So again, it's the amount of possibility there is interesting. The other thing is, it's not a labor-intensive process. It does take a lot to do it, but once you've done it, you don't need to do it again. So yes, it's an investment of time, it's an investment in doing these things, but you only need to do it once. But the outputs that you get from it, you can use this information so many times in so many different fields, not just heritage, but like I say, for other sectors as well. And I'm sure this information will be important, you know, wider afield as well. So like I say, this concept of do once, use many times, I think is a key thing really. And yes, it's an investment of time and money, but you know, I think that would prepay tenfold, you know, once you've done this on a larger scale. The other thing as well is, again, with research, it's actually letting the sources dictate where our understanding lacks. The great detective story. So we've got these maps, and we know the maps don't cover everywhere. There's always going to be gaps. There's always going to be areas that we don't know. But a lot of these sources actually start giving us clues on where to look next. So, for instance, this area, although this area is a map to the north, we know that this map tells us, well, actually, this is because the land is owned by the Lord Bishop of St. Athos. So where do you go to next? Well, hopefully, there might be records of the Lord Bishop of St. Athos that gives us information about these blank areas. So, we can use all these mapping sources like a big jigsaw to be able to work out where our gaps in knowledge are. The last thing as well then is the enhancement of the historical record. So again, we've got all this information, we can actually enhance, just from a heritage point of view, we can enhance our historical records too. Some of these maps are fantastic because they give us features that have been, either haven't been picked up archaeologically. So there's one here, which is Cadastral. So this is on the Llandegla Enclosure Awards, which is from 1830. And again, this is a feature that hasn't been mapped anywhere. And in fact, myself and my colleague Scott went out one day, and you can see it's a big mound on a hill. And the reason it's been missed is because now it's under the Llandegla forest. Whereas, back in 1830, this is before the plantation was planted. So you could be able to see these things. The other thing with these maps as well is they give us the first iteration of heritage. Because these maps are so old, they might give us the first incarnation of when historical features were mapped. So things like Offa's Dyke, I know I showed you before with the first edition, there might be older maps which also show depictions of that and might help us aid in our understanding of, if it was longer, if it was shorter, or it stopped there. So we can use that information to really benefit our understanding of the landscape. Appreciate that might have gone over a little bit longer than an hour, but I'll leave it there. So I'll invite all your questions. But I would also like to thank you all for listening, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you this evening. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr, John. Thanks very much, John. Ni wedi derbyn ambell i sylw a question. We've received a number of comments and questions. I'm going to go through them one by one. Just to ease you in, the first question is, how many townships are there or were there in Wales?
That's a very good question. Off the top of my head, I'm not entirely sure. But again, I think this sort of demonstrates why we need to develop our understanding here and have an accurate data set that potentially represents that. Again, I'm not entirely sure. I know not every parish had a township, but there were quite a few. The exciting thing with townships there is that, we can use them, especially in places like Flintshire, that they probably do have some bearing with things like the March of Lordship and stuff like that as well. So by understanding those townships, it might help us to actually develop all the data sets and stuff as well. But unfortunately, I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, thanks, John. And then the next one is from an anonymous attendee who says, I'm curious to know why you chose to use the term polygonal data rather than the more widely recognised term of vector data and attribute data. Yeah,
that's a fair point. I deliberately chose that because I wasn't sure if people would be familiar with the term vector. But yeah, it's a valid point. It's exactly the same thing. But I thought polygonal might give a better idea of just what we mean by, sort of creating a shape for each in the landscape feature. But yeah, you're completely right. It is the same term, but I just chose it for that point of view, just for ease of understanding.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. The next question is from Graham, who asks, thinking forward, do you know when greater LiDAR coverage for Wales might be available? And are there any plans to include AP and or LiDAR data sets as layers within the Deep Maps project?
Yes, well, funny enough, outside of the Deep Map, I know that there is a big programme at the moment for Welsh Government. I think it's Blue Sky, who are doing a complete LiDAR survey of Wales. And I think that data is going to be made available next year. I'm not entirely sure on the dates, but I know that is coming. In terms of this project, we will be looking to integrate 3D data. One of the exciting things that as a test we're going to do is we do also have mining maps and actually show underground features as well. And because this area does have a lot of lead mines and stuff like that, we are going to look at to see if we can generate a 3D map of a historic map in that sense, of the mine shafts and things like that. We will try and do things like that, but I think out of the scope of the project, we won't be making LiDAR available as part of in the project interface at this stage. But I think if we were to do a larger project, that's something we'd look at. Again, the same with aerial photography. It is a fantastic resource, but again, you know, I know our photographic collections are very, very detailed, and we've got thousands, if not millions, of photographs. And trying to include them in the project area for what we've got, although it's small, it's still related to probably, you know, a couple of hundred. You know, I think we just don't have the time. But again, if we were to look at that in future, that might be something we'd consider.
Okay, thanks, John. This was also from an anonymous attendee. Why aren't you also digitizing the lines like tracks and roads, etc., and point data, for example, spot heights? These could add a lot of value for potentially little extra time.
Yes, no, what I didn't show you before is we are actually recording trackways. What we've done is there's 3 polygon layers we're creating. So the first one is just the map polygons. There's then a second polygonal layer called trackways, and they're actually the trackways that are plotted on. The reason we split them out is because if we had the trackways in the polygons for everything, the acreages wouldn't match up properly. So the idea is that you can overlay the trackways, and that would preserve the acreages of each plot, so we could double check. We are recording lines and things like streams and boundaries as well. We're not recording the spot heights of these as of yet, but because of time, my initial plan was to actually record point data for things like trees, because we know in the 25-inch, certain symbologies of trees were actually surveyed like they surveyed every single tree potentially. So we were going to be making point data for trees and spot height and things like that. Unfortunately, it's just a question of time. You know, like I say, it's only a 2-year project. And although the first edition is the fantastic map and it's the greatest thing we do, we've also got to be conscious that we want to try and get back to those earlier maps as well. So yeah, it's a question of time really. But if we do have time towards the end of the project, that'll certainly be the first on the list to do.
Okay, thanks, John. The next question is from Bob, who asks, it's the errors which are of interest. Variations from master map may be measurement error, but can also show movements of features. How do we avoid losing historical data through formatting on the modern polygonization?
Yeah, no, I think that's always going to be an issue. And like I say, what we try and do is, at the moment, we're trying to capture that through the geo-referencing. We're trying to make the geo-referencing as best as possible. And yes, there is issues with the OS, but again, you know, the drift there, there's never going to be one solution which is going to be completely accurate. And I think we have to take at face value that, yes, you know, there is going to be some inaccuracy, but with the tools we've got today and the data we've got, you know, this is the best way to do it. I think that's the best way to look at that. But yeah, there is always going to be inaccuracy, and I think we just have to accept that really more than anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Very good point.
Quick questions about sharing the URLs, which you promised to do already.
Yes,
so we'll share it to the chat, but also for those people who sort of signed up for this, we'll also follow up with in an email as well. If we can. But we will go on to the next question while you do that, John.
No worries. Keep going.
You're listening with one ear and typing with the other.
I can multitask. Okay, there we go. There's the 2 links anyway.
The next question is from Christopher, and it says, apropos of crowdsourcing additional data, it sounds like the Layers of London project. Have you been in contact with them?
No, we haven't. I am very aware of that project, and yes, we are doing some very similar things. And I think they're some of the groups of people that we've outlined to talk to. We've also been talking to the is it the D-type project, or there's a project that's looking at routeways of Wales and Britain, and again they're doing similar things with historic maps to look at routeways. So we have been in touch with them as well. But yeah, you are right. You know, we are. I think what the important thing is, we're all coming to the same conclusion that this is the way forward and this is the way, you know, we need to be mapping. But yes, we will be in touch. And from what I've seen of that, the London project looks absolutely fantastic too.
Mm-hmm. The next question is from Dave, and it says, well, thanks for a great presentation. You've shown us digitizing the graphical assets. How much work is it how much work would it take to digitize the textual assets, like the books of reference, etc., and codify them to constrained vocabulary, and then associate to a polygon's unique ID?
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. We didn't do this within the scope of this project because that was done under Kinetic. So the tile mapping project did something similar, where I think they obviously had points, and then that was linked to the actual entry in the books of reference. Scanning them, I don't think would take a long time. I think that's something we can look at doing in future. But I think from our point of view, because the original book of reference is nice to have and nice to view, but because you've got that information contained within the polygonal layer, it's not saying that you don't need that reference, but we're recording the information there as best we can. But yes, that is a future potential you could look at doing and having that codification and linking across. But again, once you've got this data in this polygonal format, you can do that very easily. You're starting from a known point, and then okay, where to do digitization of the assets, the attributions and stuff like that. But again, it's you've already got something physical to start working with. In terms of timescale for that, I'm not entirely sure. It depends on how big. If you would do it for the tithe, but again, that's already been done. Obviously, that was through crowdsourcing, and that took I think it was a year or a couple of years that they had that. For smaller maps, like estate maps, they do have books of reference, but depending on the size of the estate, you could probably do it relatively quickly, really. But I do agree with the gentleman who's raised the question. I think that is a good opportunity for crowdsourcing and things like that as well.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Rebecca, who first gives a very useful link to the living levels in the project down in Gwent, but they haven't got access to the master map data, and she's asking about the copyright status of the polygons that have derived from the master map data.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So before we start this project, we had a meeting with the OS to talk about the use of this data, because obviously very conscious that we are using OS master map and we're deriving data from it. However, my understanding and what we got from talking to them is that they are trying to make their data more open as possible under government mandate and open government license. So I think, first of all, it's worth having a conversation with them, but I'd anticipate that a lot of this data is being made more available. But again, it depends on what context you're using it. Because we're a research organisation and educational, obviously we've got a license that is going through that type of thing and that way, and that's why we're able to share the data. However, if you're using it from a commercial point of view, then obviously that's a little bit different, and that's where obviously you'd have charges. So I think it's investigating if it is commercial or private or educational, that type of thing. But then just having that that discussion with the OS really. But my understanding is that they are they're trying to make as much as available to the public as possible under as open licenses as possible.
Okay, thank you. We've got eight questions left, and so we need to go through those fairly quickly. But the next one is from Jill, who says, "I appreciate this is just a project area that you're doing at the moment, but what happens after the project is proved the concept? Will a lot of further funding be needed to do the rest of Wales?"
Well, this is a big question. So this project is very much to prove the point that we can do this. And then after we've done this project, hopefully we'll be investigating how we could do this at bigger scale. There are a number of options we could look at through, again, AHRC, carry on the funding there. But there's also bigger potential places like Welsh Government. If we can prove that we can use all this data in different ways, it just strengthens the case that, not just for heritage, but wider sectors, that might help strengthen the case then for funding outside of research or anything like that. But it remains to be seen. I think at this stage, we're just focusing on proving the point and getting the data there. And I think once that's finished, we will obviously be sitting down to assess next steps. Me personally, I'd love to do the whole of Wales. I think that's where we need to go, but that might not be feasible in the current climate over the next few years. So hopefully the best thing to say to that is watch this space, really, see how we get on.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, John. The next question is from Caroline, which is, why do you think Britain was at the forefront of mapping so early on? Is it the need for good mapping for waging internal wars, like between the Scots and the English and possibly the Welsh?
That's a good question. Sort of. I think it's a bit half and half. I think part of it is our obsession. Well, I would say we're at the forefront of local mapping, of regional mapping. In terms of world cartography, that was very different with people like Dutch cartographers and stuff like that. But in terms of Britain, I think it's interesting because we've got a obsession with land ownership, and that goes all the way from the medieval period, even up until like the census of the early 20th century. There's the Lloyd George maps who he did, after the First World War, a doomsday survey of Britain, which some of them aren't accessible. But again, a scale of mapping using the OS to actually map who owned what, where was what. So I think it's a bit of an obsession with ownership, who owns what, who's got what. But yeah, there's also the Ordnance Survey. Traces it back to like Henry VIII, isn't it? Who basically commission the Ordnance Survey to draw up areas that might be in risk of invasion. And the Ordnance Survey have a long thing of military, the military maps and producing maps to basically make defences and things like that. So I think it's a mixture of both, really, but it's a very interesting question.
Thank you. Hugh asked another question about LiDAR, which I think has probably already been answered, because he asked how LiDAR fits in. I think the question was probably asked before you answered the first question. And then Joe asked, where can I see all the maps and documents pertaining to the Ogwen Valley?
Well, what I could say is that, again, there's two links I can share. Well, there's one link I can share. For the Cynefin project, all the tide maps have been surveyed for the whole of Wales, so that would be a good start. I'll pop the link in the chat at the bottom, which is Places of Wales. So that's the tide maps. In terms of other stuff, I'm afraid that's way out of our project area, but the best place to look at is the local record office to see if they've got stuff. And also there are places like Old Maps Online and stuff, which are preview services, but you can get views of maps or previews. So that might be a good place to start as well. But I'd certainly check out Places of Wales, which are the tide maps.
Okay. And then Estefania asks, says, thank you for this great presentation and project. At some point in the presentation, you pointed out that in the case of non-coloured maps, it is sometimes difficult to identify what type of feature it is represented on the map. Therefore, in the process of adding data to polygons, there could be some sort of human interpretation of the archival data. Is that a common issue you have to face in the process? And in the case it happens, how do you face it in the database and in the deep map?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and well picked on. Yes, it is slightly an issue. There is one way around it, though, is that the maps that we sort is that we got the maps that were from National Library and North East Wales Archives. There are other iterations of the OS mapping. So, for instance, the British Library have a complete collection of the OS sheets. But what they've got is the parish set. So when the OS started doing the first edition survey, they did parish by parish, like the ties. And then they decided that, well, it was just too time consuming. So they just did everything in sort of one go and just quarter sheet by quarter sheet. What's interesting with those maps of the British Library is they are all colorized. So what our plan is that once we've digitized everything and where we've got black and white sheets, we're going to have a trip down to the British Library and photograph the sheets that we don't have colorized, and then we can piggyback using the colorized versions to then edit the data, so it definitely will be accurate. But if we didn't have that option, you're definitely right that it is an issue. There would be an element of interpretation. Sometimes it's relatively straightforward to work out what's a building, what's not. But like I say, in other areas, it can be quite complicated. But that's our workaround for the moment. So there is versions of just colorized maps, but the reason we didn't use them is that, like I say, the parish data set, and also because this is very much a Wales project, we wanted to include the National Library and North East Wales Archive, so that's why we chose their collections to digitize. Again, in future, if we do this bigger, maybe that's something we need to think about. And if you've got, colorized versions, it may be better to use them. But again, that's a question for the future.
Okay, thank you. And Sarah says, great talk, John. Rolled across words, what a wonderful source it will be. Just an example, as you know, not all the tide maps include field names, but deep mapping, including state maps, might fill in the gaps at a glance for future researchers. Yeah,
no, that's a very good point. And yeah, I think that's one way we can go. And again, it's interesting, some maps and some names remain relatively static, and there's others that do change throughout time, especially, going back earlier. And again, we do have our inventory of place names as well at the Royal Commission. So again, this is one way we could use this data set to help enhance that record as well.
Okay, thanks very much. The next question is in y Gymraeg. Mediadog, mae modd I ni gael mynediad a chopi caled o'r mapiau. Is there a way to get access to hard copies of the maps?
Yeah, so all the maps when you look at the data we've made available, you'll be able to work out which source we've used. So we always try and link back to the source originator. So the hard copies will either be in North East Wales Archives or in National Library Wales. One or two which are our own collections. But again, if you wanted hard copies, they would be the organisation to get in touch with. But each source should be linked, so you'll be able to work out exactly where we've got the source from and who to get in contact with should you want to view the original.
Okay, thank you. Russ asks about using crowdsourcing for aspects that we don't have time to do, like the mind maps and so on. So mind maps, yeah.
Yeah, again, I mean, it would be nice to do this as a crowdsourcing project, but I think because it's some of it's quite difficult mapping, we've taken that view of not crowdsourcing that element. But yes, there are things we could do with that. And I think once we refine the process and the easier you make it, it could be that you can actually do this as a crowdsourcing project. I always think the crowdsourcing projects work well though when it's not a simple task, but something that is straightforward to do. And like people have pointed out, some of these maps are very difficult, and it is a bit of interpretation sometimes, especially the first edition, because they map so much. But yeah, I mean, there is potential there if you can refine the process to crowdsource. And things like the other sources, mind maps and things like that. Yeah, I think if we can, it's just finding out the mechanisms by which to do that, and also making it accessible. I think that's the onerous in any crowdsourcing project. It has to be easily accessible, but also, something that people will be interested in doing as well.
Okay, next, just comment really from Dave, saying that in reference to Estevania's question, the database and attributes could benefit from a confidence attribute as well.
Yeah, we could stick that in. I think that's an interesting thing. In fact, what we've done historically with boundaries as well, we have a confidence thing there. So with the inventory for battlefields, when we try to map the areas of battlefields, we've used a similar system, 1 to 7. So 1 being definite, we know where this is, to like 7 being, well, we know because of the nature of medieval sources, it's like, well, we know it's somewhere in Wales. So yeah, we could employ a system here. To be fair, I think with the mapping we've got and the mapping stuff so far, we haven't come across any issues where there's any, there's no interpretation. We're just recording what's on the map. But again, there is issues there. Is the map accurate? You know what I mean? But yeah, as far as we know, at this moment, I don't think we need it, but I think it's something we should consider going forward in future.
Okay, and the final question. Thanks for a fascinating chat. The National Libraries of Scotland has the LiDAR, but the question is about whether the deep mapping project has a side-by-side view. This is very helpful as it's layered, yet each layer is individually shown. Yeah,
no, that's a fair point. I know, yeah, the National Library of Scotland are doing their big mapping project. Yeah, I think that's the benefit of this system, is having a layered approach where you can turn things on and off and overlay things. I think that's the key here, is to make this as visual as possible, but also giving you the tools to be able to start analysing this stuff as well. I mean, obviously that's very difficult to do with physical maps, but I say going back to the polygonal data, again, that's where it comes into its own, because you can change symbology, because you can overlay things. It just makes interrogation and analysis a lot more easier than if you just have the the raster or physical image on the computer. So yeah, I think that's a fair point.
Okay, excellent. That looks like all the questions, John, all 23 of them. Diolch yn fawr I ti unwaith eto am sgwrs wych ac am ateb y hoff cwestiynau. If anybody's got any further questions, you're more than welcome to contact us after the talk, either through social media or by using the contact details on our website. I gloi, hoffwn I ddwch yn fawr I chi am ymuno â ni heno, I staff y Comisiwn am drefnu, ac yn olaf, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi, John, am y sgwrs ddiddorol iawn. Thank you all for joining us tonight, to the Commission staff who've been involved in the arrangements, and of course to John for a fascinating talk. Nos da.